Welcome to the Washington Post's special report on COVID-19. I'm Libby Casey, the anchor for politics and accountability, joining you from my home in Washington. Today, we'll fact check the rumors and stories about where the novel coronavirus actually originated. We'll also get the latest from Capitol Hill from one of our reporters who's up there dealing with social distancing and everything else. And we'll dig into the science of the coronavirus, including some alarming stories about children getting sick from a mysterious syndrome. But first, here are the latest headlines. There are staggering unemployment numbers. More than 33 million Americans have filed for unemployment benefits since the coronavirus came to the US and disrupted life. It's 3.2 million in the past week alone. And yet there is some high optimism among unemployed workers that they will be able to return to their jobs. 77% of those polled in a new Washington Post Ipsos poll say they do think they'll be able to get their old jobs back. And the White House wants the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, to revise a report that offers localities advice on how to reopen public places. President Trump's team says the guidelines are overly specific. Well, more than 4 months into the first signs of this coronavirus outbreak, there are still questions about just how it started. And so my guest is Meg Kelly, a fact checker at the Washington Post, part of the terrific fact checker team. Meg, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you after so many months of not seeing you in person.
Thanks so much for having me, Libby. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So I've been watching your videos that you and the team have been creating with fascination. And the one you did about the origins of the coronavirus is just especially important. Why did you dig into and investigate and fact check these stories that were circulating about where the coronavirus originated?
So I think you just nailed it, right? Anytime you hear a rumor and it sort of starts to build steam, especially when it makes its way to the White House, we always want to sort of go in and lay out all of the facts and all of the evidence for any part of the rumor, every part of the story. So when we started the story, that was really our goal, is to say, okay, well, this is a thing that's out there. Let's put all of the evidence for it in one place and see what it says.
And the thing in question was this story that was circulating that the coronavirus was actually released from a lab, that it didn't come from the wet markets as the Chinese government has talked about, but that it originated in a lab, and members of the Trump team and themselves have even talked about that. So let's start with what the Chinese government has said about its origins.
Sure. Most recently, when we spoke with the embassy last week, they said that they said that many scientists have pointed to it being from a natural origin. They have said that it's a complex matter of science. And as you just said, initially, they really pointed to this wet market in Wuhan that is close in proximity to two labs as the origin. They were quick to close it down. They were quick to say, hey, it started here. We know that, and sort of put a case closed, finishing on it.
Yeah. You point out with the absence of crucial evidence because there has not been a lot of ability for others to go in and fact check what the Chinese government has said. So you point out that when we don't have the evidence, what fills the vacuum are theories. And so some of the
Totally.
theories you explore are, did it come from nature? Was it a bioweapon that was like intentionally unleashed, or did it come from a lab? So let's talk about them one by one. Nature. How would it work for the virus to have come from nature?
Sure. And before I dig into this, I just want to say that this is sort of where most scientists think has happened. The way that it would happen in nature is there's sort of three different paths. One is that you had a bat who had this coronavirus and passed it to a human. That could be, through skin to skin transmission. There could be a number of different ways that virus went from the bat to the person. More commonly, what happens is the bat coronavirus would have gone to an intermediate species. So this is what happened with both SARS the first time around and MERS. The virus would sort of transform in that species and become a new form of coronavirus, which would then jump to humans. Now, the third option, which is like the one that fully blew my mind, is bats are relatives of other animals. So it's possible that this just came from a completely different species altogether that we don't have enough evidence to explore.
Okay, so second, a bioweapon. Is there any evidence of that?
No. Every bioweapons expert that we spoke with basically said flat out, absolutely not. And there are a couple of tells on this, right? Like the structure of the virus doesn't have any inklings of a virus that we've seen before. It isn't something that scientists research a lot. There's no big moves in the genetic code, which generally is sort of like a giveaway that somehow humans have messed with this.
Okay, so third theory, a lab. Now, there are at least two labs in Wuhan that research bat coronaviruses. So what are these labs like? Like, what do they do?
Sure. They're two sort of very different labs. The Wuhan CDC is what scientists call a biosafety level 2 lab. And so they, you know, work in really what we think of as lab like scenarios, white coats, they sit at tables. Um, the Wuhan Institute of Virology has a biosafety level 2 lab, but it also has a biosafety level 3 and level 4 lab. And when you get to the level 4 lab, that's more what folks think about when you think of the movie Contagion. People are in these big plastic sort of contraptions, there's filtered oxygen, everything is very, very controlled. And in each of those places, they have been sampling and collecting and sequencing and experimenting on back coronaviruses for about a decade. The Wuhan Institute of Virology has, one of the largest collection of back coronaviruses around the world, and in part that's to sort of be able to know what's all out there, and with the hope of preventing another type of incident. Because they have the level 4 lab, more people have been suspicious of that as a possible outbreak. That being said, I also want to say that many bat coronaviruses aren't dangerous to humans. And so that's why most scientists are comfortable working with them at a level 2.
So, there have been concerns about safety protocol. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, our colleague Josh Rogan reported a couple of weeks ago that there were some State Department cables citing safety concerns with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There have also been some reports from Chinese scientists and other studies that have sort of pointed to similar safety concerns about the biosafety programs that China's been running, that there's not enough training and there's not enough support. You know, I don't think we know enough to say one way or another kind of how to weight that evidence.
Hmm. You point out though in your reporting that it's not just lax safety protocols that would have to sort of, fall through the cracks or be a problem for a virus to go all the way from a test tube to infecting a person to spreading to other people. So, what did your research and fact checking help you learn? What else would have to happen?
Totally. So this also sort of blew my mind was the virus, even if it has the ability to infect humans, which not all viruses do, right? There are plenty of bat coronaviruses out there in the world that don't have the specific spike that's needed to infect the human cell. So even if they have that, right? Like even if they have potentially can do that, that doesn't mean that they actually are strong enough to do that well or to be able to survive the immune system long enough to infect other humans. So a couple of the scientists we spoke to said, yeah, it's okay, you're doing this research on things that can infect humans, but we don't think they're particularly good at it.
So, Meg, one thing that I learned a lot from your reporting was that just like we sort of focus on and learn about like the genetics of a person and look at like the structures of a person, scientists are also looking at the virus that's been, circulating, and then they look at what was being worked on or studied in these labs. There are a lot of similarities, but there are some key differences. So what may sound like a small difference to me, it turns out to scientists is a really big difference that's important because it helps us trace back the origins.
Right. So, one virus that came out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they initially sequenced the virus that causes COVID-19, and they reported that they'd found this virus that was sort of like a 96% match. And to you and to me
And
at first,
96
I
sounds
was
like a lot, right?
right,
Yeah.
like that's a lot, right? And so I brought that up with scientists. I was like, yo, this seems like, that's not very far away. Well, what they said to me is the 4% that's different is actually the most important 4%, right? That's the 4% that can infect humans. So, the virus that they had that was 96% similar couldn't actually hurt you. Um, in addition to that, scientists, because they're able to study the genetics of these things, could tell that that virus was, 20 to 50 years older than the current virus that we're dealing with. So the way one scientist put it to me was sort of like they might have the same, say, great, great, great grand virus, but they're not in the same sort of immediate family tree.
So why is that all important at this moment?
Well, it's all important because there's been so much rumor and speculation swirling around these labs, and as we start to think about, okay, well, there's safety, they have something that's similar. All of these initial pieces really sort of add up to a lot of circumstantial evidence that have made people quite suspicious, and rightfully so. But I think it's important to remember that we don't know enough about what was in their freezers or what specifically they were currently working on to point a finger there. And additionally, we have to keep in mind, that most of these bat coronaviruses and most of the ones that humans know about are not dangerous to people. So I think keeping all of that in context is helpful as we sort of look at the various theories that are out there.
What would it take to truly know exactly where the virus came from? Because you're not finding evidence that it came from a lab. You're finding zero experts who suggest it could be any kind of like an intentional bioweapon or anything else. But what would it take to really nail down the origins of this novel coronavirus?
Sure. Well, you'd need both to have a sample of the animal or the place that it came from, whether that's a vial in a lab or somewhere else, and you need to have DNA from the first person because, you need to have a sample of the virus from the first person who was infected. And like anything else, the virus transforms in each person that it infects. So that's why you're starting to see different strains of it around the world, and so you need those two things to match. So even if we were able to go through the lab's freezers and say, okay, hey, well, we have a virus that's like really similar and it has the spike. Until we were able to match it perfectly to that first person, we couldn't 100% confirm that that's where it came from.
All right. Meg, how do you and the fact checker team decide what to cover? There's, so many erroneous stories circulating right now about the coronavirus. There's so many political questions. Where do you begin? How do you choose your stories?
We really try to unwind complex policy questions and complex visual stories, right? So when you see lawmakers or politicians putting out either visual information, right? We live in a world full of videos these days, or making statements that don't quite have the right policy understanding behind them. We want to make sure we can unwind those complex topics for our viewers and for our readers. We also tackle some of the smaller stuff too, which you can find in our database of all of Trump's false and misleading claims.
Yeah, which has been kept up so carefully over all these years. And Meg, there's a book coming out, I understand?
Yeah, so it's coming out on June 2nd. You can pre-order it now on Amazon. It's called Donald Trump and His Assault on Truth. And it essentially sort of walks you through all of our reporting and the cataloging that we've done through the database of sort of every false and misleading claim that the president has made since he took office.
Wow. Erin Blake, so nice to see you, senior reporter for The Fix, joining me and Meg. Meg, before we let you go, I wanted to have Erin weigh in on this question of, why the Trump administration might be talking about this theory, this unproven theory that the coronavirus came from a Wuhan lab rather than, from an animal that, from a bat to an animal to a human through some sort of accidental, non-engineered transmission method. What's the benefit in promoting that, Erin?
Well, it's tough to say exactly what the strategy is here to the extent that there is a strategy. I would point to two things that I think are significant here. One is that this is a message that the president's base has been receptive to, that many Republican senators, looking at senators like Tom Cotton, for instance, have really pushed for him to get much tougher on China when it comes to this. The president has warmed to that idea. He hasn't gone as far as many of his allies have in that effort, but he will occasionally kind of slip in these very suggestive ideas about where the virus came from or about China's culpability in covering it up early in the outbreak. The second thing that I think this does that maybe the president likes is that it suggests that this is something that was thoroughly avoidable, that was somebody else's fault. We remember, of course, that there was a time where he was referring frequently to the virus as the Chinese virus. He backed off of that later on after getting some criticism that this term was not politically incorrect or was leading to certain stigmas for Asian Americans in this country. But it is something that he's interested in. He doesn't necessarily want to go as far as his allies have in blaming China for this and in pointing the finger at President Xi Jinping. But he does like the idea that this is something that is not the fault of the United States, that this is something that came from elsewhere, and that it's something that could have been avoided if not for the actions of people outside of his own administration.
All right. Erin, Meg, thank you so much. If you want to find more of Meg's reporting, you can look up Fact Checker on the Washington Post. I also just tweeted out a link to her video. Definitely worth a watch. Thanks, Meg, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Erin, you've also been reporting on President Trump's own campaign attacking Joe Biden on being, quote unquote, soft on China. But you're tracking President Trump's attitude towards China and his own really soft treatment of China as the coronavirus was spreading. So tell us more about how the president was talking about China, treating China, even as he was getting some warning signs from within his own administration.
Yeah, so, despite the strategy that the Trump campaign is now employing on this, and this really began, I think, in earnest when they launched a very deceptive ad about a month ago, the first real ad against Joe Biden after he became the presumptive Democratic nominee, in which the argument was essentially that Joe Biden was too friendly with China, that he, had gone over there and, clinked glasses with President Xi, had said some things that were a little bit too friendly towards the Communist Party, things like that. That was the thrust of the ad. What we see if we look at the early part of this outbreak is that whatever the criticisms have been of China for covering it up or of the World Health Organization for being too soft on China, the president's own rhetoric on China at the beginning of the outbreak was very similar to what the WHO was saying, was very deferential towards the Chinese. And also, I think this is the new revelation here, and it was reported by the Wall Street Journal yesterday. He was told twice in January, according to the Wall Street Journal, to demand more transparency from the Chinese. He was told by people on his staff that they needed to press this issue. They needed to get more information out of the Chinese. And the president didn't just ignore that advice. He actually went in the opposite direction. On January 24th, for instance, he sent out a tweet that praised the Chinese for their transparency. As late as February 7th, he was asked whether he had any concern about whether the Chinese were being forthcoming about what was happening in Wuhan. And he said flatly no. He said that they were doing a very professional job. So I think the point is, to the extent the Republican Party and the Trump campaign want to make this a referendum on being tough on China, and certainly the president has been tough on China in other ways, most notably with the trade war, if the argument here is that China got away scot-free from the beginning of this outbreak and nobody was willing to question what they were doing, well, you could add very logically the president's name to that list if you're going to be making that argument, because he was presented with information that maybe China wasn't doing what it needed to be doing, and he resisted that. He seemed to want to maintain good relations and maybe forge a trade deal moving forward, and so he wasn't willing to go as far as his own advisors were telling him.
And I'd like to welcome to the conversation Paul Kane, congressional correspondent, standing outside the Capitol building. It's so nice to see you.
Good to see you, Libby. It's been too long.
Yeah.
Been too long.
You've changed a lot since we've seen you last.
I try to keep it trim a little bit, but what the heck? Quarantine beard. Let's make it happen.
You're looking professional. So. We're going to talk more with Aaron in a few minutes about the White House response right now. But first, Capitol Hill, I want to hear from you. What is going on here? The Senate's been in session this week. We're going to roll with the wind a little bit. We've got to that roiling noise. It's just the wind from Paul's phone. What's going on in the Senate this week? How many lawmakers are actually back? It sounds like all but a handful have decided to make the trek. The senators to make the trek back to Washington.
They the first vote that they had Monday night, they had 87 on hand. Some of that was just really travel, an inability for some people to hit their connections and such. Quite a few have just decided, by Senate standards, you usually have about 98 to 100 here. There are a half dozen or so who have just decided that they weren't going to come back unless it was a really important vote. Pat Leahy, for instance, has been here in Washington, but he is approaching 80 years old. He's the longest serving member of the Senate. He told me a little while ago that he didn't want to come unless it was an important vote. So today was a vote on the veto override attempt on the war powers Iran situation. So he did show up today. Sherrod Brown has stayed in Cleveland the entire time. He's beamed into a couple different hearings. People have heard his dog barking in the background if you're paying close attention. It's been a little bit surreal. You're seeing hearings that have never happened in the Senate, where you've got about 3 or 4 people who are there in person, and then senators will show up only when it's their turn to ask questions of the witnesses, and then most of them then leave. For some people, this is fine. Mazie Hirono, who had a really tough interaction with Judge Justin Walker yesterday at a Judiciary Committee hearing for a nominee he was trying to get a promotion up to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. She said it was fine. She is, she has had breast cancer. She is a survivor. She's a fighter. And she was going back and forth with him as if this is the sort of normal thing of her life. Meanwhile, Lisa Murkowski, for the first time ever, did a video conference hearing today. She showed up in person because she just felt like she couldn't really appreciate it unless she was there to see it happen in person. So it's been a bit of a back and forth. Everybody's got their face masks. Almost, just about everybody except for Rand Paul and sometimes Dianne Feinstein have had their masks on the entire time when inside. Social distancing has been mostly intact. The committee rooms they only have taken over the 3 biggest hearing rooms in the office buildings, and they spread everybody out to enormous lengths. So there's no public there. It's just one.
I'm going to tell you, we're looking at a picture right now of Senator Crapo. This is a Republican of Idaho, like the solitary person in a hearing room all by himself with a mask on. Yeah. We were just looking at moments ago at one of President Trump's nominees, who was also sort of sitting all by herself, surrounded by a lot of hand sanitizer. These are photos from our Washington Post team.
Yeah.
It's such Aaron, this is such a strikingly different picture. But I want to bring Aaron into this because we've seen, conflicting requests from members of Congress. Speaker Pelosi, Leader McConnell were unified initially on, and still are, frankly, on not wanting tests, not wanting these rapid response tests offered by Secretary Azar, offered by the Trump administration. They would have essentially jumped the queue in front of other essential workers to get a hold of them. The leader said no, but Aaron, we heard other members of Congress say, well, actually, we think we should be tested because we're like a potential disease vector here.
Yeah, I mean, we can't forget that not only are these lawmakers, coming in and working together, but many of them are senior citizens. Many of them, as Paul was talking about, have dealt with serious health issues in the past and have significant reasons to be wary of being in these situations. It's a situation that lots of other people in far less glamorous lines of work are also putting up with right now. And I think that there is a recognition among lawmakers that maybe it's not a great look for them to give themselves this kind of preferential treatment that other people in regular walks of life aren't getting. But it is a really interesting contrast when you look at what's happening in the White House, where top officials are being tested very frequently. They have a special testing capacity in the White House to deal with this. I'm sure there are many people who would think that it's important for our lawmakers and our top leaders to have these testing capabilities, because if an outbreak started, happening inside Congress or happening inside the White House, that leads to a very significant problem when it comes to who's leading this country. But it is a very difficult balancing act.
I mean, PK, the headline on one of your recent stories says we're disease vectors. So there's a realization from a lawmaker that this could be an outbreak on the scale of, Mardi Gras or a conference or something where everyone goes back and takes the disease home with them.
Yeah, Lamar Alexander pointed that out, and Roy Blunt made the point. He's from Springfield, Missouri, a small town that would take him 2 flights. He'd have to go through 3 different airports to get home, and then have to do the same thing on the way back. And their point is not, they don't want to be seen as jumping the line for their own benefit. But if they're going to be in session, and Nancy Pelosi wants to have the full House back in session next week to consider the next steps of coronavirus legislation, if they're going to do that, that's 400 and some House members that are coming back. And we're going to have, 90 some U.S. senators. We're now talking about more than 500 lawmakers traveling, many of them traveling back and forth. Some are staying put, some like Pat Leahy. Dick Shelby came up from Alabama this week, said he's not leaving until there's a nice long break. He's going to stay here on weekends. But most of the idea
that he would stay here in Washington. So the idea, Paul, is that he would stay here in Washington, not go back on the weekends like so many senators and congressmen usually do, and just stay put rather than like the scurry back and forth.
Yes, but most of them are scurrying. Some of them have taken have hunkered down in DC. Some are doing that, but most are going back and forth. And the point that some of these people are making, Angus King, an independent who caucuses with Democrats, Roy Blunt and Lamar Alexander, Republicans, they're just saying, look, we're not trying to cut the line. Testing is expanding. It's nowhere near where it should be. Everyone agrees that, but it is expanding. And the administration hopes to be doing 2 million tests per week, I think, by within the next couple of weeks. And Senator Alexander's point was, if you're going to be able to do 2 million tests a week, you can take 500 of those and administer them to those lawmakers so that before they go home, before they go on a plane to go home or a train or drive home, that they get tested. And therefore, if they are positive, they'll stay here in DC and shelter in quarantine. That's his point. That's the point that they're trying to make. It's a big clash, though. There's no certain answer. There is that political fear of looking as if you are jumping the line and getting that special privilege. And there's nothing America hates more than Washington people, Washington insiders getting the special privilege that they themselves cannot get.
I mean, it's important to mention, of course, there are so many workers on the Hill, whether they're staffers, to cafeteria workers, to cleaning people, to Capitol Police officers who are also required to stand up and go to work in person if the lawmakers do as well. So we can't ignore that fact. Aaron, I want to ask you though, like, what's the benefit to getting these lawmakers back to work? I mean, Mitch McConnell, if he gets the Republicans back to work, he can get more judges confirmed. He can get more Trump appointees in office. He can keep things moving forward in a way that's important to him.
Yeah, and the judges is an important thing. I mean, we need to remember at this point that Mitch McConnell, for all he knows, may only have another 7-8 months to actually be confirming these judges. This is a significant legacy item for him. If Donald Trump doesn't win re-election, the Republicans lose the Senate, either one of those happens, then that kind of train of judges that they've been confirming over the last 3+ years comes to a halt. And you don't often have those things lining up like that. You may have the Senate but not the presidency. You may have the presidency but not the Senate. And so when you have that set up, as he rightly acknowledges, this is a moment in time in which he can make this happen. And so, leaving the Capitol for everything except for coronavirus aid-related bills was not something that he was willing to accept. And that's been his priority. Of course, I think Democrats would prefer this is not the reason they're called back into action. But he holds the power over this, and this is his big initiative. And so I don't think anybody's terribly surprised that he's moved forward with this.
PK, before we let you go, is there any talk of any more relief for Americans, whether they're business owners or citizens who are facing job loss right now?
There is talk about this, Libby, but we're very much in that phase of sort of partisan ideological standoff. You are looking at House Democrats, Nancy Pelosi here again this week, even though the House isn't in session. She did a press conference today, and she outlined her mandates, SNAP and state and local funding, a whole bunch of things that extended unemployment insurance, a whole bunch of things that Republicans right now are like, yeah, I don't think we really want to do that. And instead, over here on the Senate side, where I'm standing now, you've got Republicans digging in saying we're going to have liability protections for businesses. Trump is talking about the payroll tax. So everybody is setting up their marker for where they want to be in a perfect world. But we're going to get to a point later in the spring or early summer where PPP, that small business program, its funding is going to start to dry up again. And we're going to start to hit a point where unemployment is at numbers that we have never seen before in any of our lifetimes. And we may need to extend that. Those are moments where people are going to have to be forced together to think these things through, because they're going to have to do something at some point later this spring or summer. And that's when each side will begin to shed some of their ideological standing. But for now, for the rest of this month into early June, probably, we're looking at really just a standoff. But tomorrow morning, that unemployment percentage number is going to come out. And it is going to be psychologically devastating. When it was 10%, a little over 10 years ago, when it was 10%, when Obama in his first year in office, was just sort of a politically devastating gut punch. We know it's going to be well above that. And if anything is going to break any of that logjam, it might be that unemployment number tomorrow, if it's way bigger than we expect.
All right, Paul Kane, senior congressional correspondent. Thanks so much for joining us from the Capitol. We really appreciate it.
Happy to be here. All right.
Thank you. We'll let you go. Aaron, before we say goodbye to you, I want to talk about your reporting on President Trump and the efforts to sort of, as you put it, wish away the coronavirus, and the efforts that they're making to move on to other agenda items and change the conversation right now.
Yeah, so I think what we've seen in the last several days, the president has been talking about reopening the economy for a while now, but we're starting to see him take some more concrete steps away from kind of the strict mitigation and towards an effort more focused on reopening the economy. One of the steps that he's talked about in recent days is, first, he was talking about winding down the coronavirus task force. He clarified that yesterday to say that he's going to keep it because it's so popular, but that maybe he would transition certain officials out and maybe transition others in a way that suggests it would be more geared toward the economy rather than these mitigation efforts as it has been previously. We also see a number of interviews that he's done recently and an appearance that he made in Arizona this week, where he essentially said that we are now moving toward a new stage, the next stage in this process, which is reopening the economy. Today, we had a significant development when we saw it reported that the CDC guidelines for states to reopen were being held back because there is some disagreement about how specific they are, about some of the prescriptions that are offered by the CDC that the White House has said are overly specific. So there is real tension right now, as there has been for a while, when it comes to the process for reopening the economy. But what has changed seems to be that the president wants to actually put this into practice right now. He's not just talking about it.
And Aaron, let me just point out, like, the reason why we're talking about the CDC document is because if it has specific recommendations of how to do this, and states or localities aren't meeting those benchmarks but are opening anyway, that's perhaps what the White House doesn't want to have the optics of.
Right. So now we've already seen some guidelines put out by the CDC and the White House in mid-April that basically set the benchmarks for when states could progress to these phases. A phase 1 reopening had to be 14 days with no increase in coronavirus cases. To move on to phase 2, which would be allow them to reopen more things, they'd have to go 14 more days without seeing that phase 1 reopening cause some kind of an increase. What we've actually seen is a number of states have begun the process of reopening without meeting that phase 1 requirement. They haven't seen that 14 days of decline that the CDC said they'd need to. And the new requirements, the new guidelines, which the Washington Post has actually obtained a week ago, they were not setting out new requirements for advancing into the phase, but what they were doing was prescribing what people could do at various types of businesses once they entered each phase. So here's what you can do in phase 1 if you're a child care center. Here's what you can do if you're a restaurant, things like that. Basically saying very specifically how these businesses and how these organizations would approach these reopenings. The reason that's a problem if your goal is to reopen the economy is that it does rein things in. It does prevent businesses from maybe being able to open in the ways that they want to. Maybe it makes their reopening less successful because they have to abide by these very strict guidelines. So if your goal is to reopen the economy, these new guidelines are going to be standing in the way of kind of providing the states and these businesses with the freedom that maybe you think that they should have. But it goes back to this long-running tension between Trump and some of these reopen the economy supporters and the health officials that are advising the president, who have clearly been less comfortable with that process moving forward too quickly. And so we're still waiting to see if those guidelines get released in some fashion or another. Maybe they'll be scaled back to some degree or another. But I think it just does reinforce that tension that we've seen for a very long time.
Aaron Blake, senior reporter for The Fix. Thank you so much, Aaron, for being with us. Really appreciate it. Stay with us because coming up next, we'll talk about the latest science on the coronavirus, including concerns about some mysterious syndrome that has been affecting a small number of children. Stay with us.
These days, it's anything but business as usual. That's why working together is more important than ever. AT&T is committed to keeping you connected so you can keep your patients cared for, your customers served, your students inspired, and your employees closer than ever. Our network is resilient. Our people are strong. Our job is to keep your business connected. It's what we've always done. It's what we'll always do.
Joining me is national reporter Chelsea Janes, who's been covering this story. A small number of children have been having this syndrome that appears to be linked to coronavirus. It's raising a lot of concerns and questions from doctors. Chelsea, first of all, welcome. So good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So let's keep this in context. This is a small number of cases, and we will talk about the numbers shortly. But first, what are some doctors reporting seeing in children?
I think overall, doctors are reporting pretty mild cases if they're seeing children admitted to hospitals at all. But over the last few weeks, what we've started to see and what they have reported are a very small number of children coming in with inflammation, with rashes, very red tongues, and high fevers. And in some cases, even some issues with inflammation in their coronary arteries and some heart damage. Those are sort of on the very extreme end. So they've been pretty worried about this to the point that, various health organizations across the world have released alerts and are trying to kind of let pediatricians know what to look for and how to deal with this.
So where are cases being reported? I know you've been following to see what areas and where authorities are, sort of talking about this.
Yeah, it first popped up in the UK actually, and they were the first to sort of issue an alert. And almost within days, people here were starting to see it, mostly on the East Coast, almost exclusively on the East Coast, as far as we know so far. Boston, New York, and DC have started to see this. But it began in the UK, and as far as we know, it's still fairly limited in scope, particularly in the United States.
So these cases seem to have some of the hallmarks of an illness called Kawasaki disease. So what is Kawasaki disease?
It's a condition where kids present with the same symptoms that doctors are seeing. A lot of fever, rash, inflammation. It's fairly new on the scene. I think the 60s it was kind of identified. And the difficult thing about Kawasaki disease is that it's not known exactly what causes it, and there's no sort of official cure. Although, outcomes are very good. It's very treatable if it's identified in time. And the worst case scenario sort of with Kawasaki disease, which again really mostly affects young children, is that you're going to get this inflammation in the arteries, in blood vessels, and that can lead to some lingering heart damage. And it's one of the main ways that if you see kids with heart issues, which you don't often see, a lot of times it comes from, severe Kawasaki disease.
So, it's important to reiterate again that this is a small number of cases, relatively speaking, and we're talking about mostly, people who are children, not the very youngest of children in this case, but other children. So, Chelsea, as you research this and talk to doctors, they are quick to point out that most kids do not show symptoms or have very mild symptoms from coronavirus.
Right. And that's one thing that almost across the board to a doctor, you're hearing them say is, look, this is scary and it's certainly an issue that we have to figure out, but it's not the norm. And it's not a signal of something, as bad as the coronavirus at large, where you should hide your kids and take all these extraordinary measures that are different from what we're advising otherwise. By and large, very few children are being hospitalized with the coronavirus. And of that, it is a very low percentage that are showing these new symptoms. But, it's really, I think, just kind of an alarming thing to hear about kids having heart trouble. And the fact that they can link it in some ways to coronavirus is, I think, what's really kind of causing people so much alarm.
So doctors are emphasizing that parents should not panic, but they are saying that in these rare cases, medical intervention is important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, as far as I know, and doctors I've spoken to, they've had really good outcomes. I mean, even in kids who this has gotten pretty far with, they've had good outcomes. They've been able to treat it and people are recovering. But it does require treatment because, as you say, you never really wanted to get as far as dealing with arteries and heart damage if you can prevent it.
Joel Achenbach is joining us. Also, Sarah Kaplan. Welcome to the two of you. Thank you for coming into the conversation. One of the big mysteries has been about how the coronavirus affects children. So, Joel, what are researchers asking when they look at children and think about, why would an older person be more susceptible to coronavirus, but a younger person more resilient, not showing any symptoms, maybe mild symptoms? We're not even sure really at this point how much of a carrier they are. What are the questions researchers ask, Joel?
Well, clearly, if you can figure out why children are generally protected, that's the keys to the kingdom here. I mean, it's so many of the stories we do, we say pretty prominently that there are all these uncertainties. I think that it's getting to kind of, I wish we could say this is why this is happening. It's clear that the immune system in a child is not as mature, is not as robust, is not as developed, and that in some of the lethal cases that you see is the result of the immune system going haywire, and not going haywire, but just the kind of an overreaction to the virus. And so that has that cytokine storm, you've probably heard of that, it tends to happen particularly in much older people who have dysregulated immune systems. So I think but for kids, we don't really know why they tend to be protected.
All right. Chelsea James, we're going to let you go. Thank you so much for talking with us. I appreciate
Thanks
hearing
for
from
having
you.
me.
Joel and Sarah, we've had a lot of questions written in from people who are reading the Washington Post, who are watching our coverage, and their questions really run the gamut. Here's a very basic one from Alan in Iowa. And Sarah, I want to run this by you. What actually is the coronavirus? And what are we talking about? Is this a living organism? What is it?
So that question, is the virus a living organism? That's actually like a scientifically interesting question. Viruses are one of the simplest things in biology, and scientists sometimes debate whether or not they can even be considered alive, because all they are is a packet of genetic material, either DNA or RNA, surrounded by some protein and some lipids, and they can't do anything on their own. They can't feed themselves, they can't replicate themselves. For a virus to function, it needs to invade a host cell and hijack that cell's machinery and basically put that cell's machinery to work, making copies of itself.
Sarah, we're looking at the animation that our colleague Brian Monroe did. That's like that classic image that we see of the ball with the red spikes.
Yeah.
So break it down. What's the ball? What are the red spikes?
So the inside that ball, that's where the genetic material is. That's basically the virus's instruction manual for making more of itself. And the coronavirus is actually has longer genome than a lot of other viruses. It's a pretty sophisticated virus, sort of genetically speaking. There's 30,000 base pairs. So you can think of it as a book with 30,000 words in it. And then it's surrounded by this protein shell, and the characteristic spikes that you see are these kind of tools that the viruses use to attach to our cells, break their way in, and then take over.
So, Joel, you and Sarah have been following and reporting on this question of various strains of coronavirus. And there was a sort of a lot of attention and interest yesterday because of a paper written by scientists at the Los Alamos National Lab, and this hypothesis that a strain of coronavirus has come from Europe that's more contagious, but it has been met with some skepticism. So put this in context for us.
Well, the key thing to understand is that every virus mutates. In fact, it mutates while it's in your body. I mean, makes trillions of copies of itself. So the fact that it's mutating is by itself not a concern. We would expect that. There are lots of strains. I mean, there are hundreds, maybe at this point, more than 1,000 strains of the virus that are being examined in laboratories, by scientists, and they're looking at the genetic code. What it's hard to do is make a link between, okay, well, here's a strain that's got this mutation on the spike protein. I mean, Sarah did a great job of explaining how how it works, but there's still spike protein, which I think binds to a receptor on a cell. If that structure changes a little bit, in theory, the virus could become more contagious. But the problem is there's other reasons that one strain can become more popular, as it were, more common, more abundant. And it can just be what's called a founder effect. It's first to show up in northern Italy. There's a totally vulnerable population. Lots of people get sick. And so you see this abundant number of this one strain of virus. So is it meaningful or is it random? And so the story that Sarah and I did tried to work that through. It is possible that you could have a more transmissible strain, which is what the Los Alamos paper hypothesized. This was a preprint paper. It's preliminary research that hasn't gone through peer review. I wouldn't say preliminary, but let's just give it a little time to see what other researchers say about it when they look at it really closely.
Yeah, I think we're also hungry for information and knowledge that we all jump on anything that shows some new information or new development. You use this word set, Joel, a preprint. And Sarah, you were tweeting this morning about being on our show, and you talked about how people should be careful. In your tweet, I was reading, people should be careful about reading a preprint. So Sarah, what is a preprint?
Yeah, so traditionally, when new scientific research gets published, it'll be published in a journal like Nature or Science, things that people have probably heard of, and it'll go through this process called peer review. So other scientists who are not involved in the research will read the paper, will provide feedback on it, will ask questions. And the idea is that coming up against this skepticism and undergoing this criticism makes the science stronger. And it makes the results more reliable. But often, and especially now in this era where data sharing is really important, science is operating at warp speed and researchers want to get their information out there as quickly as possible. People are posting to these preprint servers. So it's basically a website where you can put your paper before it has been accepted and peer reviewed by an established journal. And it's a way to keep track of what other researchers are doing. It's a way to communicate. It's a way to get information out there. But it does mean that it's not as reliable necessarily as something that has been published in a journal, just because it hasn't undergone that really intense scrutiny. And so that means that when we go to those preprint servers and start looking at those papers, you just need to keep that in the back of your mind. Often science is not a lot of eureka moments. Really, it's the accumulation of gradual realizations and discoveries that build on each other. So anytime you get a paper, something like this, that claims something kind of extraordinary, you want to wait for more data to come in and support it. You don't want to sort of take the first, take everything at face value, because it still has to be demonstrated and evaluated. So I think that we all I totally understand the thirst for knowledge, right? You want to know what we're facing and what is the right thing to do when we have so many questions and uncertainties, and that's very hard to live with. But if we react to every paper that comes out, we might wind up making some choices that aren't wise.
That's exactly right. I just want to add one thing. As Sarah alluded, there's this saying, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I think it's attributed to Carl Sagan. He may have lifted it from someone else, but we're in the business when we write about science of we kind of know that rule, but in this crisis atmosphere, sort of as you noted, not only are people hungry for information, but kind of sensational information can take off. And there was some paper that said, if you cough, the particle can travel 27 feet, and that's technically maybe true, but that doesn't mean that a coronavirus particle is going to make you sick 27 feet later. And so we're trying to, we just want to get it right. It's hard, and this is a new era with looking at these preprints, these non-peer-reviewed papers, I kind of wonder if we're ever going to go back to the old system where we waited for it to be published in a reputable journal. I mean, that's how we've been doing it for years and years and years. And now suddenly, here comes this fire hose of research, and we have to stay on top of it. And people do want to know. We can't just ignore it.
We have a good question coming in to us from Jean, who writes in from Columbia, Missouri, and asks about these potential different strains. And Jean wants to know, if there are different strains, would this require a new vaccine every year, like the flu? Now, obviously, we're still in the search for a vaccine, so a lot of unanswered questions. But Sarah, as scientists and researchers are trying to figure out how they identify the profile of the coronavirus and just what makes it up, are they already talking about that sort of future-looking question?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an open question. Like Joel noted, there are, various strains of this virus circulating that carry different mutations. So far, the consensus from scientists is that none of the mutations make the virus functionally different. So, like I said, the genome is like a book with 30,000 words in it. If you change one word in a 30,000 word book, you're not going to change the book very much. So you would need a mutation on something like the spike protein that changes the way the spike protein works. That something like that might change the way the virus functions. So far, we don't have evidence that that is happening. One thing that might be of comfort to some people is that this virus actually mutates more slowly than most other viruses, including the influenza virus. It mutates about a tenth as frequently. And so that does give us a little bit more time to work on things like vaccines and antivirals that you want to have a semi-stable virus so that your tool that you're developing actually works when you're able to implement it.
Well, coming up, we'll talk more about coronavirus in terms of herd immunity, something people have been talking about lately, and we'll also talk about antibody tests. Stay with us.
These days, it's anything but business as usual. That's why working together is more important than ever. AT&T is committed to keeping you connected so you can keep your patients cared for, your customers served, your students inspired, and your employees closer than ever. Our network is resilient. Our people are strong. Our job is to keep your business connected. It's what we've always done. It's what we'll always do.
My guests are Joel Achenbach and Sarah Kaplan, science reporters at the Washington Post, who have been digging into all the details about coronavirus and answering so many of our questions through their reporting. Joel, you had a piece a little while ago looking at antibody tests, and the headline was that the antibody tests support what's been obvious, that COVID-19 is more lethal than the flu. I still continue to see things on social media that are wrong, talking about how the flu is like more lethal than coronavirus, more dangerous than coronavirus, as people try to minimize the danger of COVID-19. What does the research show?
Well, I mean, just for starters, someone should look at the mortality records that the CDC put out just a few days ago from the last several years that show all-cause mortality. And what you see is this unbelievable spike starting in March and going through April to now in excess deaths. Like basically, there's, if you knew nothing else about what's going on in the world, you would say, what happened in the United States starting in March of 2020 that killed so many people? All right, and that's without without testing for COVID. It clearly is capable of causing a lot of mortality at a much faster rate than the flu, because people have some immunity to the flu. I mean, this is a novel coronavirus. We have no immunity to it at all. And all of the antibody tests, they do tell us it's more widespread than we thought. This is an important piece of information. It means it's probably more transmissible or more easily spread asymptomatically through the society, which has its own, it's kind of a good news, bad news thing. The fact that you don't know if you have it, or if the person you're encountering who seems healthy could have it and could be infectious, that's a problem. But it also tells you a lot of people have such mild cases, they don't even know they have it. A very good question is, why is it that some people, when they get it, they go downhill fast, and they're for whatever reason they wind up on a ventilator or worse. So, the numbers are clear that it is worse than the flu.
We had a question coming into us from Illinois. Sandra writes in and asks, what is herd immunity and how does it work? So Sarah, I want to hear about herd immunity from you, but I will point out that we just saw a Fox News commentator on television encouraging people to go out and get coronavirus and be brave in order to sort of increase herd immunity. Is there any scientific call for something like that to be done?
No. So herd immunity is the idea that once you have a certain threshold of the population that has the appropriate antibodies, has the immunological defenses against a pathogen, either because they have a vaccine, they've been vaccinated, or because they've had the illness, you're able to contain outbreaks, right? So the reason that we all get the measles vaccine is because, and that measles, when measles is introduced to the US, it doesn't spread through the US like wildfire, is that most people have the measles vaccination, most people have the immunity, they're not going to catch it if they're exposed to somebody, and so you can kind of contain that outbreak. I think that this virus is incredibly dangerous. We don't have a treatment for it. It is not a, there are the sort of diseases of childhood that some people think it's okay to get, like chickenpox or something. This is not that. And scientists don't recommend chickenpox parties either. The safest way to obtain immunity is to have a vaccine. And so the idea that we should be risking our health and facing a lot of uncertainty when we don't really know what that risk entails, I think, public health officials are not recommending that. The recommendation is to abide by the policies that have already been talked about, practicing physical distancing, washing your hands, avoiding unnecessary interactions with other people, and keeping yourself and everyone in the community safe.
Sandra was also wondering, how long does it take to naturally create herd immunity? Do we have any sense of that?
I think sorry, Joel.
No, you go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, I was going to say that, it partly depends on how fast the virus spreads, right? If it gets through the population really quickly, then you'll get to herd immunity faster. And also, again, the vaccine, the safest way to obtain immunity is to be vaccinated. But we do have, so sorry, you want to add to that, Joel?
Well, just that you need to have about 70% of the population has to be immune before you have the herd immunity. Maybe it's a little less, maybe it's a little bit more. Right now, what percentage of the population has had COVID so far? Most estimates I've seen are in the single digits in terms of percentage. It might be getting close to 10%, but I don't think many people think that. In New York City, it's definitely high. It's probably well over 25% in New York City now. But for the whole country, it's still low. And if you do the math and you look at the lethality rate, the infection lethality rate, if you did nothing and just went out and said, hey, let's get sick with COVID to see what happens, you wind up with 1 million people dead over the course of about a year or so. And no one thinks that's acceptable. So we're trying to limit the infections now, not embrace the infections.
It almost seems surreal to have to be saying that again, because of course we've been hearing that from epidemiologists and scientists for a couple of months now. But here we are repeating that message. I have this smart question coming in from Kathy from California asking, so if you're asymptomatic and you're a carrier of COVID-19, perhaps you just haven't gotten sick yet, or you're someone who is fortunate enough not to get sick, what is the benefit of taking your temperature before entering places, for example, like a place of business? Joel.
Well, a lot of people who don't have a fever have it. I think taking temperatures, it's one tool. It doesn't tell you that much. It's kind of like, it's a data point. It's not proof of anything.
Great. Okay, guys. So before I let you go, Joel first, then to Sarah, what are you watching? What questions are you asking in the coming days and the coming weeks? Are you watching the states that are loosening their restrictions? Are you watching to see federal government guidelines? What's on your mind, Joel?
Well, certainly want to see what happens when you open up. Do you see the curve spike again? And we're going to try to follow the science that's coming out about what is this disease doing to people? Why do you see these differential effects within a population and also from country to country?
Joel, I mean, thank you, Joel, and Sarah, on to you to close this out for a final thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, from a scientific perspective, understanding sort of why the disease has so many different manifestations, sort of how it interacts with the body, is going to be really important for potentially identifying a cure, because you'll sort of understand how it functions. And so scientists doing the research to sort of analyze that, I think, is going to become really valuable.
All right, Sarah Kaplan, Joel Achenbach, thanks so much to both of you for being with me and for answering so many questions. Really appreciate it. And it's good to see both of you.
Good to see you too.
Thanks, Libby. Thanks. Great.
Thanks,
I see you, Sarah. Thank you.
Bye.
I will be watching over the course of the next week Dr. Fauci testify before Congress. He will be appearing before a Senate panel next Tuesday morning, and he'll be there with other leaders of the CDC, also representatives of HHS and the FDA. We'll be carrying that live at the Washington Post. Now, that hearing starts at 10 o'clock next Tuesday morning. We will be live with a team of reporters at 9:30 Tuesday morning Eastern time. You can catch us on WashingtonPost.com, also catch us on our Washington Post link on YouTube. Just hit subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, and you can get notified about upcoming videos and events that we're covering. So we will be back with you next Tuesday morning covering Dr. Fauci's testimony before the Senate Health Committee. We'll also be back next Tuesday at 3 o'clock to recap Dr. Fauci's testimony and go over more stories in our special report about COVID-19 from the Washington Post. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm Libby Casey, and I look forward to seeing you next week.